to find out what's wrong with the law, to put people first, to understand that everyone is someone's son, their daughter, their wife, their husband, whoever it is, they're important in someone's life, and they need to be in their life. If you don't treat it like that, and you treat it like a number, or you don't have the resources to fight it, it's pretty much a losing game.
It punishes people for things not only that they didn't do, but that they never intended to do, and in some cases never even foresaw. Punishment, to be effective, should be based on what a person does and what they intend to do. And so we have situations where someone who's never killed anyone, never wanted to kill anyone, never intended to kill anyone, are serving not only life sentences, but there's 400 people on death row in America who've never killed anybody.
My son Brian is incarcerated. His story starts back in August of 2006. He was 18 years old at the time, about ready to finish high school, and he got a call from a friend one day who also was a high school buddy, a best friend, and the friend was looking to buy some pot and called my son and asked if he knew where he could get some weed, as they call it. And my son called another acquaintance, also a girl that they went to high school with, and she put my son in touch with her boyfriend who was over at her house at that time, and he was a little bit older. He didn't really know the high school clique, and that set in motion a chain of events where the plan was for the two other gentlemen to go pick up the pot and come back to where my son was waiting with his friend. Something changed and my son was in the car with them. He then gave his friend the option of riding along with, or they would come back to his location. The friend decided to get in the car and ride with. So there's 4 people in the car. It was my son, his friend that called looking for the pot, the acquaintance's boyfriend, and then he had a buddy of his that was driving. My son was in the front passenger seat. His friend was in the back passenger side, and while the car was rolling down the road, an argument broke out in the back seat, and the gentleman that was the boyfriend of the female, and I don't mean to be confusing here, it's just not mentioning names. Anyway, in the back seat, an argument broke out and a gun was produced. The friend of my son who called looking for the pot was shot in the head. He ultimately died of his injuries, and after this gentleman shot that young man, he then turned the gun to my son and told him to say his prayers, and I guess by the grace of God my son's life was spared that day, which I can imagine was probably the most terrifying moments of his life. About 7 a.m. the next morning I woke up to a knock at my front door, and when I opened my front door there's 4 or 5 police cars on my front lawn in my driveway. There was 2 detectives at my door, and they held up a piece of paper and said that they were there to serve a warrant for said my son's name, and said that the warrant was for first-degree murder. What ultimately happened was he was charged with first-degree felony murder. He didn't kill anybody. How is it murder? There was actually 3 trials, 3 attempts to take him to trial. Trial number 1 was, have you ever heard of the term prosecutorial misconduct? Ultimately, they did find him guilty of first-degree felony murder, so at 20 years old, and was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. He was granted an appeal. Trial number 2 ended in a mistrial, so while they were preparing for trial number 3, they offered my son a plea deal. And they basically offered him a 22-year sentence if he pled to a second-degree homicide charge. He said, I didn't do this. I didn't commit this crime. My friend was just looking to buy some pot. I'm having to admit to something that I didn't do. Well, how is that justice? I mean, it was a very tough decision for my son to make. He said, I'm going to take the plea deal because at least it guarantees me a release date, and I know at some point I'm going to get out of prison. He's been incarcerated now, it's been 13 years.
We can't impeach what's in somebody else's mind. And so we should not be held responsible for what someone else does.
Like many of our children, my son was a drug addict. He used to self-medicate to stop the voices in his head, is what he told me. He was arrested in 2012, 2 months after he turned 21. He was actually arrested for robbing a pharmacy for drugs. No one was hurt. A week or so before he was at the pharmacy, he had been told that he could get in on a drug buy. And he went with these two guys for what he thought was a drug buy. And from what he told me, you never go to a dealer's house if you don't know them. So he waited like a block and a half away and all this occurred. He was a block and a half away. Yeah. About a week or so later, while he was in the county, he was escorted to an interview room and interrogated by a detective about a home invasion murder. He was never given his Miranda rights. He did not ask to talk to her, and he was not informed at the beginning of the interview that was being recorded. My son was charged with first-degree felony murder. He was never at the scene of the crime. He never met the victim. He never had a gun that night. He had no idea that the co-defendants had a gun, nor that they intended to rob and kill the man. First time he ever knew what this victim looked like was when he was shown a picture of him. He waited in county 6 years to go to trial. Yeah, 6 years. And no joke, I think he holds the record for longest person waiting to go on trial in the county jail. But at his trial, the judge refused to allow the jury to hear the victim was a drug dealer, which essentially left my son without being able to present any type of defense. He couldn't explain to the jury why he was in the area that night, and there were a lot of errors and false statements made during his trial. So he was convicted under the felony murder rule as a principal to the crime and given life without parole for a crime he didn't commit and didn't even know was going to happen.
It happened about 11 years ago when one of our children had a previous medical condition that we didn't know about, and it actually caused her to pass away. I was at work at the time, and because my wife was home alone with the children, she was charged with first-degree murder of our child, being, according to the medical examiner, that she had caused her death. And as a result, the rest of the children were taken away by the state and refused they refused to give to any family members, even though we have a large family. And then she was charged with, like I said, first degree murder, and then subsequently was convicted. And the reason why it was raised to first degree murder is because they claimed that she had abused our child, and that didn't happen. But again, later we found out she had a medical condition. And as a result, she was given life without parole after she was convicted. So since then, it's just, we went from a large family, happy family, to just me in the house. And the rest of the kids were taken away from us, adopted out, and she's now in prison for life, according to the state. So we had 6 children, all adopted, and then 2 of them, the brother and sister, we found out were actually drug babies. The state did not tell us about older child and the medical condition that was there all previously, and later the state even knew that there was a medical condition, which they later admitted but did not think it was important, and that came out in court. And yet the appeals judge, still with all that evidence that was brought forth, thought it was still necessary for my wife to stay in prison, even though all the evidence that the state did not rebut and could not, even though it was proven medically by other outside medical people outside of the state of Florida who actually did thorough work and did actually do the research and did their job. They saw that daughter who passed, or our daughter, she actually had sickle cell anemia, and the state ignored that. And the sickle cell is what caused the asphyxiation and caused her death, and we were never told that. And this Department of Children and Family and the state have worked overtime to cover that up, and as a result, we're still in the appeals process as of now. They charged her with the abuse, which later turned into, they raised it to capital or felony abuse, So that way they charged it as a felony in order that they could get the first-degree murder charge. So it was just like the state of Florida saw that fit to do that, and then subsequently, she was indicted and then convicted. Of course, the jury never got to see that information, never got to hear any previous medical condition, and they went based on what the story that the state told them, and of course the state provided pictures in which our team did not, and they did not do their job. As a result, again, life in prison.
My son, he's a drug addict and was living in a halfway house at the time, working a job full time. On a Saturday afternoon, he went into an open church and there were two people practicing music for the Sunday service. He came in the front doors and he sat down in the sanctuary to listen. He listened to the music for a while and he even had conversation with them. And then he went out. Well, when he left the church, the pastor's wife went back to the pastor and said, there's this young man came in. So they looked to see where he'd gone. And in the parking lot, he was leaning inside one of their cars. The window was open. He was leaning inside it. So the pastor locked the doors and went back to his office. Well, the police report says this time he entered the church with a knife in hand and went to the pastor's office. He told the pastor that he was desperate and he needed cash. The pastor told him he had no cash, but he did have this laptop and a cell phone. So Dustin took the laptop and cell phone and left the church. The pastor and his wife stated they watched him walk down the sidewalk, so he was gone, and then they reported it. It was probably a week later till they finally identified my son as a suspect. I had picked him up at the halfway house to take him to my house for dinner, and as I got a couple of streets over, there were police cars surrounded us, and they took my son into custody. While he was in jail, though, he told me, he said, Mom, this public defender told me that I could get life for this. And I said, no, you can't. And he said, yeah, she said I could. Well, I just didn't believe it. I guess I was so naive. The public defender called me and she said, what were your son was in prison? And I said, he's never been in prison. I said, he wasn't in prison. She said, are you sure? I said, I'm certain he was not in prison. So what it was, 7 months prior to that, he had been in jail and he was in there for stealing $500 from his roommate. He'd been in jail for 1 year and 8 months when they offered him a plea deal of 1 year and a day. So he took that 1 year and a day and left the jail. That 1 year and a day was considered a prison sentence. So that qualified him for the PRR statute that enhances your prison sentence. They charged him with armed robbery and aggravated assault. Now, my son did not get just one life sentence. They also stack charges to make sure they can bury you, and they stack the charges. So my son has 3 life sentences. One for going in the church the first time, just sitting and listening, and the second one for looking inside the car, burglary of a conveyance. And the third one was the actual robbery, where he did have a knife when he approached the pastor and asked for money. So he actually has 3 life sentences, and that's all due to the Florida PRR.
In 1995, at 18, my son was convicted of simple robbery, which he committed to feed a cocaine addiction. He received 16 months for this crime. There was no court-ordered drug treatment of any kind, nor did he receive any drug counseling during his incarceration. He was actually told that his sentence was not long enough to qualify for the available programs. We knew little about the drug culture, and at the time we were naive to the ease of access to drugs inside Florida Department of Corrections. Upon his release, we assumed that he would be free of a severe drug addiction. However, his untreated addiction led to an armed robbery charge. And although the crime was non-fatal and there was no physical harm whatsoever, he was given a natural life sentence at 21 years. Robbery in itself does not carry a life sentence. My son received the life sentence due to Florida PRR law, prisoner releasee reoffender, which states that if you're released from prison and are charged of another crime within 3 years of your release date, you must be sentenced to the maximum length of time for said crime, which is natural life or armory. Under normal sentencing guidelines, my son would have received up to 16 years of a prison sentence for the full 16 years and a lifetime of probation if after 16 years of imprisonment, the state felt my son would still be a threat to society. However, our pleas were to no avail. The prosecuting attorney said she had no choice but to prosecute under PRR, mandatory state guidelines, and the presiding judge, Cynthia Angelo, stated, "I have no choice or discretion in sentencing this defendant. I have never said or believed that my son didn't commit a very serious crime. Armed robbery is considered a violent crime, as it should be. All crimes deserve a fair and proportional sentence, and I believe his life sentence is not fair or proportional. My son did not take a life, nor did he not cause any physical harm whatsoever. He was dubbed the gentleman robber by local law enforcement because he was so polite during the robberies, saying please and thank you and giving his victim's wallet back. You're going to need this ID stuff," he said. My son was 4 years old when his biological father passed away. He then experienced mental, physical, and sexual abuse by trusted family members, both male and female, until his early teens when the abuse was discovered. Around the same time of this discovery, I remarried and my son was adopted. He finally had a loving, caring father, but due to the previous abuse issues, there were severe trust and anger issues. My husband passed away in 2006, but he never gave up hope that one day his son would come home.
I'm a real big kid advocate. I really believe kids are our future. And when I first met Pat and I heard Pat's story, it angered me more than anything. I don't believe that our society should be able to throw people away and say that as a juvenile, you are not worth hope, not worth anything, that we could give you a life sentence and lock you away for life. Pat was 17 years old. He was charged as they put him in prison for the second time because at 16 he caught a charge as well. So they put him in a juvenile system. Then at 17, he caught another charge and they placed him in adult prison. 17 years, and it was for aggravated burglary and carjacking. At 19, he caught this case in prison that he's serving 2 life sentences plus 50 years. He was in Marianne Prison up in the Panhandle. Back late 80s, early 90s, there were a lot of rioting going on in prisons in the state of Florida, and there was some beating going on by COs on inmates at the time. The COs were beating on inmates that were in confinement, and Tampa and Jacksonville were going to have a riot. And Pat's he said, walking from the chow hall, literally you could hear them beating on the prisoners, and they were in there yelling and screaming, talking about they were going to kill them. We're going to end up killing these guys. That's how bad they were yelling and screaming. Help me. So they reacted, and that's what a riot started. This riot went on for 2.5 hours in the prison. He got the charge of rioting. He got the charge of aggravated battery on an LEO, 2 counts, and 2 counts of battery. He was 19 years old. Anybody who has children, and especially young males, know that kids do things on impulses. And honestly, you give me anybody under the age of 25 who does not understand sometimes the consequences to their actions. I mean, all make those mistakes. And the way I feel is we are as a society to pick and choose the ones that we will save, and the ones that get to have that walk of freedom or that chance or whatever. Pat will be the very first person to admit the things that he has done wrong. He is 47. Pat has been down for 30 years. 30 years.
We were 14 years old. We were high school sweethearts. But then his family moved. My family moved. We lost contact. There was no Googling each other back then. So, long story short, he got involved with this woman. And so him and this lady were living together. And there was a murder that happened at the home. And she was the one in the home at the time. He was 22. And it was 1991, I believe, is when it all began. In court, they could have looked at either person, but they didn't even look at her. They only looked at Chris. There was zero evidence against him. But this was down in the Florida Keys, and it's a very small, like 4-mile island, and everyone knew her. No one knew him. He was kind of new to the area. Jurors even said, yeah, we all know each other. We all, it's a 4-mile island. Of course we all know each other. And the public defender didn't do anything that he should have done to help Chris. So he's the one that got railroaded, first-degree murder. He's got life with the possibility of parole is what they gave him. And the jury and that whole court scene in the trial, it was like a circus. I read through the transcripts. It was like a circus. The forensic expert proved, because of the stomach contents of the person who was killed, he was able to prove that Chris was at work on a different island 30 miles away when the murder actually happened. So because of the ineffective attorney and the forensic expert proving when the murder actually happened, he was granted his habeas corpus by 4 federal and 1 state judge, and the lawyer was supposed to file it in a certain time period. The lawyer thought he had till December to file, and he only had till April, and he filed it in the wrong timing. So because the habeas corpus wasn't filed in the correct timing, he has been stuck on this procedural technicality close to 30 years now. A little over 28 years now. Grandparents have died. His parents have died. He's lost everyone. And Chris is innocent, but the lawyer didn't file it in the correct timing. And so now we've just been fighting this battle for 28 years now. Him just stuck in prison and stuck on this procedural technicality, and there's no law to govern this technicality.